In the webinar, I'd like to talk to you about why kids with ADHD are particularly vulnerable to stress. As a neuropsychologist, I'd like to say something about the neurobiology of stress and what's going on in the brain when stress is happening. I'd also like to help you understand what I've called the saving face cycle and why kids with LD and ADHD respond in a particular way to stress, that helps them really stay safe. Then I'd like to talk to you about my de-stress model, which is an acronym that can help you remember the kinds of things we can do to help kids find greater success and happiness in school and in their lives. I'd like to talk about what stress is and talk also about the impact of stress on life and learning in general. And start with that first topic about what is stress. And as you know from a high school or college biology class, stress is a physiological response. It's also an emotional response or reaction to any kind of danger or threat. And what's important about this is the last part of that sentence that you see before you. Any kind of danger or threat, either perceived or real. And I'll speak to you a lot about how kids with learning disabilities and ADHD who don't understand their conditions may perceive themselves under threat, even though we as adults believe that there is no actual threat. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Stress is a protective mechanism. It's something that helps us keep safe. It's something that's built into us as humans. Every animal has the ability to respond with stress, and it keeps us out of harm's way. So stress is an event that triggers what we know of as a fight or flight response to help us get out of a situation that we deem is dangerous to our health or our survival. Stress can be short-term, that is, it can be a response to something acute that happens, something that happens at the moment, or stress can be chronic. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to be focusing on the latter kind of stress, that goes on for a long time. Why do we care about this? Well, the take-home message of this webinar is that when stress is unrelieved, the cumulative physical strain that's generated by the psychological stress that we're talking about can harm the body and can harm the brain, can change the way the brain operates. There's a boy named Alex that I had the opportunity to know some years ago, and I want to tell you about an experience he had in school. And this is to give you an example of how this little boy, who is a quite talented little boy but has pretty severe dyslexia, dealt with stress. So here's a worksheet that Alex got back from his teacher after having finished a unit of instruction. You can see in the upper right-hand corner in small red ink a note written by his teacher. She says to him, read and draw carefully. So he was supposed to have done several things. He was supposed to have drawn a big owl in a tree, 3 bats on a fence, a witch with a green hat, and a boy making a face on a pumpkin. We don't have time in the webinar to show you all of his drawings, but rest assured that he's a very good little artist. So here's a little boy, I think a really nicely drawn little boy. This is a first grade student. The little boy is smiling. He's carving a face on a pumpkin. He's doing exactly what he was told to do. Well, this teacher questions his ability to identify the appropriate gender of this little character. And she writes again in her small constricted red pen, boy, question mark. Well, some kids would crumble at an activity or a response like that. Alex remains strong. It's a little bit later. That first slide was done around Halloween time. Now it's Thanksgiving, and Alex thinks about this as payback time. He hasn't forgotten about that feedback his teacher gave him at Halloween. And here's a worksheet that Alex got back from his teacher. This time she writes, still in that small red constricted ink in the right-hand corner, excellent. So there must be some improvement here. So he was supposed to have made a big fish on a hook, a turkey in the straw, a deer running in the woods, and finally a boy walking his dog. Now you remember the feedback Alex got about the gender identification of the boy in the first drawing. He's thinking, teacher, I was really paying attention to the feedback you gave me back at Halloween. This is definitely a boy walking his dog. Now, if I could hear your laughter, I think you'd be at least chuckling in your seats now. No doubt about it. Look at those teeth, though. As a psychologist, I learned a long time ago not to overinterpret children's drawings and to interpret them in context. Well, there were some teeth like this back at Halloween time, and that I just thought was evidence of an evil mask. Now, these teeth are definitely signs of aggression. If you look down at the lower left-hand side, you can also see the dog is pretty aggressive there. So he's subtly getting back at this teacher. Curiously, she has nothing to say about this except that he did an excellent job. Well, I'm happy there are boys in the world like Alex. He had a lot of teachers who worked with him over the years, and sometimes teachers loved him and sometimes they didn't love him. But he was a talented little boy who made up for some of his difficulties by being a good artist, by having a great sense of humor, and that helped him survive. Some of his teachers left the profession early because of Alex, I think, but he did a really good job and is today actually a very successful artist. Still not a very good reader or writer, but a great young artist. So kids like Alex will survive, but what about all the other kids who aren't resilient, who don't have any, what I would call, money in their self-esteem bank? For the rest of this presentation, whether you're a parent or a teacher or another professional working with kids, I want you to think about a specific child that you worry about, either someone in your family or your extended family or someone in your classroom, a child who's had difficulty and who's been under stress and struggled because of a learning disability or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or some other condition. I'd like to dedicate the rest of this presentation to the child you've got in your mind right now. We know that not all stress is bad. There are a couple kinds of stress. Good stress is the stress that tells us to get ready for a challenge. It's the thing that gets us ready to go, gets us prepared to deal with anything that's going to come our way. We've been equipped with this good stress because it's a kind of readiness anticipation system. Bad stress, on the other hand, is the kind of stress that says to us in a very loud voice, better get out of here because something bad is going to happen. If you think about the early roots of this, you can think about our ancestors living in caves. Bad stress is the kind of stress that says, there's a saber-toothed tiger walking back and forth in front of the cave. You better get your family to safety because if you try to confront this stressor, not only you are going to get killed, but your family is going to get killed, and that's going to be the end of the story. So we want to differentiate between good stress and bad stress. Important to remember that bad stress happens when we don't have any control over threatening events. When things happen in our environment and our brain is saying to us, there's nothing you can do about this. You're going to be hurt by this, you're going to be harmed by this, and there's no escape from this. And that's really where I got the title of my book, Nowhere to Hide. I'm worried about kids who experience bad stress all the time, and they really don't have any place to go. That's okay to go, to get over this feeling or get away from this feeling of stress. And these are some of the same symptoms we see as adults. Some of them are child-focused or child-centered. Look at the list for a minute. Bedwetting, trips to the bathroom, sucking your thumb, biting your nails, sleep problems, eating problems, changes in behaviors, emotional lability. Lability has to do with unexplained extremes in emotions that we see in some of these kids. Kids who have low self-esteem, kids who are depressed, kids who get involved in high-risk behaviors like drugs and drinking, and then a whole host of physical or somatic symptoms, the same ones we experience too when we're under stress: back pain, muscle tension, stomach aches, headaches. These kids get ulcers, they have tics, and there's an increase in allergic reaction in kids and adults under stress. So here's a whole host of symptoms we need to be aware of. If a child, we know statistically when families have a child who has a special need, whether it's learning disability or ADHD or more serious or severe disabilities, mental disabilities, physical disabilities, that places a lot of stress on families. There are more separations in families where there are kids with handicapping conditions. There are more divorces. There's more stress. There's more arguing. There's more of an impact on other kids in the family and extended family members. Mothers and fathers often isolate themselves from their neighbors because of some of the behaviors that kids exhibit, and the isolation adds to that stress. There are a lot of other reasons why life is more stressful. We really live in an environment where we get hit with stressful information all the time. No matter how well we try to protect our kids from television, we hear information about war and violence. We hear the daily news. We hear financial news. We hear about political situations. And we worry about sports. There are a lot of things that get kids and families upset. We're also under an influence of media like never before in the history of our culture, of our species. So kids are getting influenced by what they see on the screen, both in video games and by the music they hear. We live more and more in competitive environments in which kids are held up against standards that are difficult or difficult to achieve. Their performance is compared to other kids, and the inter-kid comparison can add to stress. High-stakes tests like national standards and state standards testing has increased the anxiety level of lots of kids and teachers and parents across the country. I think it's become very hard to find what I call an oasis of tranquility, a quiet place for kids to go. It's hard enough for adults to find a quiet place, but unless kids are protected by their parents and by teachers and by the environment in which they find themselves, they're under a lot of stress that we don't even know about. Little kids don't know how to talk to us about this stress, and older kids tend to clam up and not talk about it at all. I think here's a really funny New Yorker cartoon. Not funny, it's almost sad. 9 o'clock circle time, 10 o'clock art fun, 11 o'clock snack, 12 o'clock SAT prep, and this is kindergarten, folks. So you see the stressors start early. It's an interesting situation where a lot of kindergarten teachers talk about the stress that they're under to make sure that kids in their kindergarten class are reading by the time they leave kindergarten. We know enough about brain science to understand that some kids will be readers by the time they get out of kindergarten. Some kids are in fact readers before they go into kindergarten. But a lot of kids, because their brains just haven't developed to the point that will allow them to be readers and to use the decoding system that reading requires, will not be readers for a year or two more. So as soon as they leave kindergarten, they move into a reading-rich curriculum and can be under deep water very quickly. Why is it so hard to help these kids? I've worked with kids with learning disabilities and ADHD my entire life. I started out my professional career as a special education teacher, and I've watched kids under stress try to deal with this. A lot of the kids who have conditions like learning disabilities or ADHD really can't recognize this feeling. They can't label this feeling. They don't see a relationship between what they're doing and the stress that is impacting them. They're acting up or they're acting out, but they can't label it. They don't understand why it's happening, and their teachers don't understand it either. So often when teachers and parents see behaviors that are negative behaviors, are worrisome behaviors, parents and teachers often fail to see these behaviors as what I would call maladaptive reactions to stress. Kids trying to get out of a stressful situation, but having no place to go, no way to get out of it. And so adults in the kids' environments very often react to the event, what kids are doing, and don't think enough about the causes of the behavior. The result is increased stress. And so you can see how this cycle sets itself up early on in the life of kids. Think about how stress just impacts learning, your learning, my learning, the learning of adults, the learning of kids. When you're worried or overwhelmed, you have unpleasant physical sensations that are related to anxiety that flow through your body. You may have rapid breathing, you may have sweaty palms, you may have a rapid heart rate. This physical sense of being overwhelmed gets in the way of cognition. So it's not only these external behaviors that you exhibit, but there's so much going on in the brain that gets in the way of learning that it's important for teachers and parents to understand that, and ultimately very important for kids to understand that. We'll talk about what's happening in the brain in more detail later on, but at this point, let's make sure that you understand that stress has a significant impact on brain function in that when we're under stress, the primitive parts of our brain, the center of our brain, the midbrain, goes into survivalist mode. We're trying really hard to protect ourselves from the ultimate danger. That's the danger of death, and we're geared to do that. But when our survivalist parts of the brain takes over, the part of our brain that's responsible for thinking, typically the frontal lobe, the prefrontal lobe of our brain, right behind our forehead, the part that's responsible for what are called executive functions, that shuts down, that turns off. So you think about that. You're under stress, your survival part of your brain goes into gear, and thinking becomes impaired. It's good for survival, but it sure is not good for school. And when the stress happens early and it happens over and over and over again, we know that this unabated stress can cause the brain to build up actually build up abnormal brain cell networks that have a negative impact on learning and memory. So we see how significant this problem is and how dangerous this problem is for kids. Why are kids with these conditions especially vulnerable to stress? Well, this builds up. This stress builds up. They have these cumulative experiences. They have more failures than they have successes. And these poor academic experiences build up to the point where kids have little tolerance for school, and they're extremely frustrated. You'll recognize this familiar character, Dennis the Menace, who says, by the time I think about what I'm going to do, I already did it. You might say that I don't think Dennis the Menace was ever formally diagnosed, but you might recognize him as a boy who might have had attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, who ended up getting into trouble for doing things impulsively throughout his little cartoon life. So let him serve for the moment as a poster child for this problem. I think there's too much attention on what's wrong with kids and not what's right with kids, both in school and out of school. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. My job is to do diagnostic evaluations of kids to identify the impediments to learning. So I spend 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 hours with kids, exposing them to tasks, neuropsychological tests, that sample aspects of their thinking or their cognitive behavior. The cruelest thing about my job is that I have to work with kids until they fail. I have to get them up to the point at which they stop answering questions correctly. Well, luckily I can explain this to kids when they're sitting across the table in the testing environment, but still it's not an easy thing to do, to subject yourself to the scrutiny of an adult who's looking for your problems. So in my practice and in the practice of many other neuropsychologists who consider themselves strength-based clinicians, we look for the assets that a child brings to the testing table and to the classroom and life. But if we think about this, how many of the people involved in the lives of these kids, how many services that these kids get are really focusing on improving their weaknesses? They're saying there's something not quite right about you, not quite good enough about you, and we're going to help you fix that. These kids spend a lifetime in the presence of well-trained, well-meaning people, but these people are trying to make them do a better job, to help them do a better job. So their intentions are in the right place, but how would you feel if you went through a life where everybody around you says, you're not quite good enough yet, we believe in you, and that's really nice, but you're not there yet, so we're going to help you get there. That creates a setup for frustration and resentment in a lot of these kids. Another big problem with kids that I'm concerned about and you're concerned about is these kids don't understand what's going on in their minds. They don't understand their difficulties. They haven't learned that their ADHD or their learning disability is not an excuse, but a way to explain their difficulties. They're not like this little boy who says to his teacher, can we hurry up and get to the test? My short-term memory is better than my long-term memory. Well, those are the kind of kids I like to see us create. If we create them, we have to live with them in the classroom. But I'd rather have a kid who can advocate for himself that way than one who's hiding under a desk or throwing the desk or causing trouble in the classroom or disrupting his own learning or the learning of other people. This chronic stress that kids are sometimes under can cause them to think about themselves in different ways. Think about this. You know kids who become known as the class clown, because they'd rather be funny than feel dumb. Isn't it better to be the kid who gets laughed at for doing funny things than the one who gets laughed at for making errors? If you go to the website of Jim Carrey, the famous and wealthy comedian, he'll tell you at his website that he had a teacher, I think in 5th grade, who made a deal with him. Jim Carrey was notorious for disrupting the classroom with his funny antics, and his teacher appreciated that. And she said to him, Jim, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the last 5 minutes of every class. If you keep your act together, so to speak, during the first 45 minutes, I'll give you the last 5 to do your thing. Jim Carrey says, I became a good student, and that was the best teacher I ever had because she let me practice my art form and get laughed at and with at the appropriate times. That's a good site to take a look at. I highly recommend it for a story of a young man who's made it into a very successful and wealthy adult. I said earlier, too many kids don't understand. That should be T-O-O. Sorry about that. Too many kids don't understand the nature of their LD or their learning disability or their attention deficit disorder, and more importantly, what they can do about it. When I do neuropsychological evaluations of kids, and I know a lot of my colleagues do this as well, we take the time to sit down with kids and help them explain in developmentally appropriate terms how their brain is functioning, how the performance that they exhibit on test explains how their brain is functioning, and more importantly, what they can do about it. So kids who make what I would call errors of inattention, or kids who process information with difficulty, make mistakes that they consider to be, unless they have a good understanding of their learning style and their learning needs, they consider these to be dumb mistakes, stupid mistakes. They say, oh no, I did something stupid again. So we have teachers and other adults in the lives of these kids who also don't know a lot about ADHD or learning disabilities. It's difficult to assess these conditions, and every child who has them exhibits the behaviors in different ways. Teachers who see that they have bright, capable kids in their classroom might be surprised when these kids have difficulties or make errors. They say things like, Jake, you're really a smart kid. I'm surprised you got that wrong. Or other kids in the classroom looking at Jake and saying, boy, was that stupid. These kids that I'm concerned about hear these things all the time, even from well-meaning professionals, because the people who are sitting with them and working with them don't understand what's going on, why these errors are made. As a result of this pretty chronic these chronic messages that they hear from their environment, some kids may do what I call shutting up or shutting down, and they become quiet, sullen, introverted. They know if they keep their mouths shut, nobody will know how, quote, stupid they are. They don't talk. And this is because they're worried about, and they've learned very early in life, that if they talk and if they make what they consider to be stupid mistakes, they'll get laughed at. They'll become the butt of jokes in their classroom. They might even become the victim of bullies who are looking for a weaker target. This is a real problem. And a lot of these kids have people in their lives who are paid to help them. Learning disabilities tutors, coaches, specialists who are brought into the circle of the child's life to help support him or her so that these kids can reach their fullest potential. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what they need. The problem is that if these kids, or when these kids become over-dependent upon these paid professionals in their lives, they may start to attribute the successes that they make to all the help they get. I've written on the slide here, whose A is this anyway? I have a young man I worked with some years ago who was heading off to college. He had a very severe learning disability. He had a lot of help along the way from his parents, from his tutors, from his teachers. And he said to me, Dr. Schultz, I'm really afraid to go to college because even though I got in, I think it was the accomplishments of all those people working with me all those years that got me into college. Maybe they should go. When kids with learning disabilities experience success, they often attribute this success to good luck or good fortune. They say, well, I got lucky. Well, or they attribute their success to somebody else being kind to me. Well, she just gave me that grade because she felt sorry for me. Or conversely, they may attribute their difficulties solely to themselves. I didn't do that well, they say, because I'm so dumb, because I'm so stupid. They don't own their successes, and they take responsibility for their failures. And I think when there are so many adults working in the lives of the kids, if they understand this, if they help kids understand that what they do both to be successful and how they make errors can be analyzed and can be used as information to help them learn better. There's something that I've come to call discontinuous learning. You think about those paid professionals in the lives of kids. In some cases, a specialist comes into a classroom. His or her performance or presence in the classroom disrupts the learning that's going on. She pulls a child out for speech therapy or occupational therapy or some other very needed therapy, and then a half hour, 45 minutes later, drops the child back into an environment that's like a train going down a train track from station to station. She took the child out when he was at one station and puts him back in when the whole class is at another station. Now, this discontinuous learning can be a cure that's worse than the problem here. So I think it's important to think about how to use the wonderful services that are provided by teaching assistants, instructional aides, ancillary therapists like speech and language pathologists and psychologists to build those services into a classroom. I think the answer to the problem of good education for kids with learning disabilities and ADHD is to refine the art form of having people co-teach classes, a special educator and a regular educator working together in the same space so that their performances aren't at odds with each other, because the difference in instructional methods being pulled out of class at unusual times increases kids' anxiety. This adds to the stress that they're already feeling, and it decreases their performance. A lot of kids feel trapped. School goes on for a very long time. These are the happiest years of our lives. You can imagine what's in store for us. That's a cute cartoon about two kids facing a long and arduous road ahead. It's a cute cartoon, but it's not funny if it's your life. I think there's also way too much emphasis on product and not enough on process. We have so many kids in so many schools who are focusing on getting something done so it looks right, so it's like a model, so it meets the standards that are set up by other people. And the end product is the thing that they focus on. Well, these are kids who may be able to create wonderful products, and given areas in which they're interested and talented, they do that time after time, and that's wonderful. But in the areas in which they exhibit vulnerabilities or weaknesses, their difficulties are in the processes they use to complete the product. So in order for education to be effective for these kids, in order for them to feel a sense of control and the competence and confidence that comes with it, they have to be taught about the process they have used, both to be successful and the process they used that didn't allow them to be successful. And they have to be taught how to use the successful processes more often, and they have to be taught how to take the unsuccessful process and turn it around, tweak it, try another way is a good mantra for these kids. I think, too, we have a lack of respect institutionally for different ways to allow kids to demonstrate how smart they are, how competent they are. For example, I think there's way too much emphasis on high-stakes testing. Here's a cartoon that shows two boxers in a ring, and their managers are looking on from ringside. One says to the other, "He looks very promising, but let's see how he does on the written tests." You can agree with me that that's kind of ridiculous in that context. But in schools, all we have is the written test to judge whether kids are competent. Even when they can do things really well, how often do they get credit for those alternative ways of getting to a successful answer? The other thing that's done often to kids who have learning difficulties or attention difficulties is to put them with other groups of other kids who don't have these problems, in the hopes that the accomplishments or the talents of these kids without disabilities will pull the kids with ADHD or learning disabilities up. And I think if we think about cooperative learning, sometimes the situation is we put kids into a situation where their differences, their vulnerabilities actually become the focus of negative attention. Think about a cooperative learning assignment where kids are having to create a project together, and one child who has reading difficulties is asked to find materials that require reading, even if it's going on the internet and looking at the web for content information. Unless kids have adaptive technology available to them that lets them read without having to decode every word, lets them listen to the words by voice-activated software, for example. Unless the playing field is leveled in a cooperative learning activity, some of these kids are sometimes thought of as the anchor, that's the thing that prevents the rest of the kids from getting the good grades that they want. So we have to think about putting kids together. Poorly chosen after-school activities can make things worse. You think about a kid who's got a directional problem or who has who tends to act impulsively. Putting a kid like that on a soccer field could end up in a miserable outcome. Kids running down the field the wrong way, other kids laughing at him, this kid walking off the field with his head or her head hung in shame. Before we put kids into activities with other kids who are quite successful, we want to think about whether or not the kids we care about are going to have a chance to experience that same level of success. I often say I'd rather have a kid be a good canoeist, a good ham radio operator, a good chess player than a bad team sports player because they need a place to shine. We should encourage a lot of these kids to do things that not many kids do at all. So what's the relationship between stress and learning disabilities? Stress can make the ADHD and learning disabilities worse, because we understand that when you're under stress, you don't think as well, especially in students with nonverbal learning disabilities or kids with Asperger's syndrome who are highly anxious. That's an associated part of their condition. So if you're under stress, the problems you exhibit, the underlying ADHD or learning disabilities, may look worse. When the condition, the underlying condition, is undiagnosed or inappropriately diagnosed or unrecognized and untreated, learning disabilities and ADHD can leave the kids without a sense of control. We need to have that. So instead of saying, I can and I will, they say over and over again, I can't do this and I won't do this. And you know what? We shouldn't be surprised. Kids with learning disabilities and ADHD often find themselves at the intersection of a teacher saying, hey, I'm sure you can do this. I believe in you. And while on the surface that sounds like a good thing, you've got a kid who's thinking, I know I can't do this. So here's a kid who's got an adult, a caring, loving, talented adult who's saying, I believe that you can do this. And the child is saying, there's no way I can do this. Think about the stress that just being at that intersection causes kids. So how do you get away from that? I'm not saying that a teacher shouldn't say, I'm sure you can do this, or I believe in you. What I am saying at this point, simply, to say to the child, how difficult do you think this is going to be for you? How difficult do you think this task is going to be for you? And help the child learn to use a simple rating scale, perhaps from 1 to 5, to say 1, and you can hold your thumb up in the air right now to represent the number 1. This is a piece of cake. I'm going to be able to do this well. As opposed to, now I want you to imagine holding your hand up in front of somebody, like as in the show me the hand gesture. That's 5 fingers up. That means no way I'm going to be able to do this. If teachers and parents can help kids assess the level of difficulty that they perceive that a task holds for them, and let them do the task and then reevaluate their own assessment, you're well on your way to helping kids be better monitors of the actual, not the perceived, but the actual difficulty level of the task. And then you can teach them what to do about it, to turn a 5 into a 3 or a 3 into a thumbs up 1. So kids who are forced into doing things, I'm sorry, you can't take time out from this, Billy, you must do this, or kids who are encouraged to do this, they're put into a situation where they're backed into a psychological corner. So here's the cycle. If we stop at if we look at the top of the FASE cycle, and FASE is an acronym that obviously refers to the 4 letters of the first 4 letters of the first letter, I'm sorry, of these 4 words, fear. This is a kid who's in a situation who says, uh-oh, my stress apparatus is on high alert. I'm afraid that I'm going to be a failure. If we move from the yellow to the pink zone is, I'm going to try to get out of this situation because there's no way that I want to do this because I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to feel stupid over and over again. Then we move around to the green part that says stress, and the kid, because this is a kid who can't get out of the situation. He's got no place to run, no place to hide. Martha and the Vandellas said it well in song. This kid, he's trapped. So what does he do? He tries to escape. He tries to get out of the situation. He shuts down. He tunes out. He turns off. He acts up. He acts in, and we misread these behaviors. So when we see kids, when teachers or other specialists see kids who are pulling away from the task that we give them, who are being silly, making jokes, tearing up a piece of paper saying, this stinks, this is dumb, I don't have to do this, teachers may misread these behaviors as oppositional behaviors. They may misread these behaviors as inattentive behaviors, the behaviors of an unmotivated or lazy child. You can see now that that doesn't make a lot of sense. Think about the numbers of kids who have a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder. That's a pretty heavy label to give to a kid who's trying to stay away from a saber-toothed tiger to save his own life. So when parents and teachers misread these signs in this way and don't see them as what I think are predictable reactions to stress, the problem gets worse. The consequence is more stress. So let's switch gears a little bit and get scientific. Let's talk about the neurobiology of stress. Clearly, there's not a lot of time in this 1-hour presentation to talk about the detailed and intricate workings of the brain, but suffice it to say that stress does a lot of things, one of which is to create the production, trigger the production, signal the production of a hormone called cortisol. Some of you are familiar with cortisol. It's one of the stress hormones, a glucocorticoid. This hormone, stress hormone, cortisol, inhibits the production of proteins in a part of the brain called the amygdala that help you remember things. We can see where we're going with this already. Irregular cortisol fluctuations, we understand, can cause both extreme behavioral problems and learning problems. If we introduce stress into the lives of children or animals or adults, cortisol goes up, and cortisol can be helpful in the right amounts. If cortisol production fluctuates, it can result in kids in extreme behavior and learning difficulty. If this cortisol production continues and stress continues, prolonged exposure to cortisol because of repeated exposure to stressful events damages brain cells in the hippocampus, another area of the brain. I'll show you a picture of this in just a minute. The problem with all this is that the changes that we see in the brain relate to a corresponding decrease in cognitive skills. They make us less efficient as learners. But take a look at this picture of the brain. It's a little bit unusual, and if you look at the, I don't have a pointer to use on this, but if you look on the right-hand side, you see the amygdala, you see the hippocampus in green, and actually you see it looks like there's an amygdala and hippocampus on both halves of the brain, both hemispheres of the brain. You have to imagine that the artist has taken a large knife and slit the brain in half and spread it apart like you'd take two pieces of bread and spread them apart. So there aren't two amygdalae, there aren't two hippocampuses. But if you close the brain back up, that's where they live. Those are the midbrain of the midbrain of the brain, the center of the brain, the primitive part of the brain. On the top of this brain, you see the cerebral cortex. This is the newer brain, the new brain, the brain that's developed later on in our development as upright humans. Cortisol is produced by the pituitary gland. It's a little pea-sized gland just behind all of our noses. The pituitary gland and what it secretes controls the entire endocrine system and all the functions of all the endocrine-related gland, one of which is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland secretes a hormone called ACTH. There's a longer name for that, which we don't have time to go into now. But this hormone enters the blood circulation and goes down to the adrenal glands. Now, the adrenal glands sit just above your kidneys. These adrenal glands produce and release cortisol. Take a look at this for a minute. The yellow, funny-shaped globule in the middle of that drawing is the hippocampus. It's an important area. At the top of that and just behind it sits the amygdala, a very small part of the brain. These are, again, part of the midbrain. In the lower cutout drawing that you see on the left side of your screen, bordered by a red frame, you see the primitive brain. You see the amygdala represented there. You see the brainstem coming down from it. You see very clearly the cortex over the top of the brain like a cap sitting on top of the old brain. The old brain is our survivalist brain. When I talked to you before about the survivalist brain shutting down, that's the center of the brain. I'm sorry, the survival of the brain, the survivalist center turning on and the cortex shutting down. That midbrain in the red box is the part that goes into high gear when we're under stress. And it has a really interesting function. If you look at the arrows and follow them around a little bit, we're going to start up here at the green globule called the pituitary gland. And remember, that sits behind the nose. That secretes hormones. Those go to the amygdala. It triggers other hormone releases. Those, the amygdala and the hippocampus, send messages down, and the pituitary gland rather sends messages down to the adrenal gland, that kidney-shaped, that purple triangular-shaped figure at the bottom. The adrenal gland pumps out cortisol. The cortisol goes up to the hippocampus. It goes up to the amygdala. I'm oversimplifying this beautifully intricate process that goes on in the brain almost instantaneously when we're exposed to stress. But you can see how there's a loop. There's a feedback loop that goes on here. Too much cortisol in the blood gives the signal for the brain and the adrenal glands to cut down the production of cortisol. Let's shut back, boys, because we've got too much cortisol in the system. The problem is that when stressors are continuous, and I'm going to submit, like the stress of kids with learning disabilities, sitting in a classroom, being asked to do things over and over again that in their perception they can't do. Under that kind of continuous stress, this feedback system breaks down. The result is too much cortisol. Too much cortisol is not a good thing. How does this relate to kids with learning disabilities who are under chronic stress? This results in what I've called academic fight or flight. Kids with ADHD or learning disabilities, when they're confronted with this unending stress that's created by these tasks that are, remember, in reality or in their perception too difficult, these tasks that are threatening to their very survival, these kids exhibit the same behavior that any organism exhibits when they're under stress. They resist, they try to get away from the situation, they display what I call aggressive passivity. They shut down, they put their heads on the table, they don't come to school, they go to the nurse's office, they try to get out of the classroom, they create diversions, they knock over a desk, they challenge, they argue, they become oppositional, they act defiant. They do these things because they don't want to self-destruct. And because they see no other way to get out of these situations, they've learned to exhibit these behaviors that get them out of trouble. They think. This situation results in a re-emergence of what I call the saving face cycle. And here we see it again. Pink fear, green avoidance, yellow stress, and finally escape over and over and over again. So we see why this is a problem. This can all be pretty depressing because we think about, oh my goodness, all these chemicals are getting pumped out in the brains of our sons and daughters and children and grandchildren. And it's changing the way the brain functions. Well, the good news is there is hope. Dr. Eric Kandel, who's known affectionately as the rock star of neuroscience, is a Nobel laureate and professor of neuroscience at Columbia University, and I quote him, not quite verbatim, but he says, just as fear, stress, and anxiety can change the brain, just as these things can change the brain, behaviors and thoughts that relate to hope and love and happiness can also change it. It's completely symmetrical. I've talked about this a bit in the presentation already, but we have to understand the condition. The teachers, parents, other specialists, and especially kids themselves have to understand this condition. I'm in so many situations these days where a school is saying, I think a child has a learning disability, and a parent is saying, no, I don't think my child has a learning disability, and the school does an evaluation, and the parents do an evaluation, and we've got this unending situation of dueling diagnosticians, debating, arguing, often to the point of going to a court of law to make a decision about whether or not a disability exists. Let me make a plea for the audience listening today. If there's a difference of opinion among the adults about whether ADHD is real or about whether learning disabilities is real, bring all those people to the table. Spend a little money if you have to, because it's going to be a lot less expensive than going to court over this, to get all those brilliant people together, all those specialists together, and knock it out for a couple hours. Talk this thing out, because if you're fighting back and forth and you're choosing sides, there's only one loser in this, and it's the kid. The E part of the de-stress model has to do with educating kids about how they learn. Teach the kids about their own learning style. Pay them the courtesy of sharing the results of testing with them. Let them know that some adults may not agree with exactly may not exactly agree with the results of the evaluation, but this kid can help us determine which adults are right, by helping the kid understand his or her learning style, and to use his own brain as a laboratory for truth about how he learns. But kids, if they don't understand what's going on with them, why things are hard for them and not hard for other people, they're going to feel dumb. They're going to shut down. They're going to turn off, and we'll lose them. Speculate means, okay, here's the information we have about the kid. Let's look ahead for the positive kinds of things and the negative kinds of things that this child brings to every learning enterprise. If a child knows that he's really good at listening, but not good at drawing, it makes sense to create activities that allow him to listen well and that won't require him to draw, because if he's drawing and he doesn't do it well, he's going to be under stress. If he's listening and he's a good listener, he's going to be operating from a position of competence and confidence. We have to get kids to move ahead, look ahead and say, what is it that you're going to bring to this exercise? For example, a teacher says, I've given you a homework assignment, kids, that I think is really important. But before you even start on this homework assignment, I want you to take what you've learned about your own brain and how it learns and tell me what's going to get in the way of you being successful. Also, write down on your paper or tell me in our interview at the end of class what's going to get in the way. I want you to analyze the factors that are going to allow you to be successful, and I want you to analyze the factors that are going to get in the way, and I want you to help tell me what you think you're going to do about that. If you don't know what you're going to do about the impediments, and I've got some ideas about how to help you. The T part of the de-stress model is to teach kids the strategies that help them maximize their successes, and I've talked about that a little bit in the speculation part of this model. But kids have to understand strategies they can use, and they have to be able to practice these strategies in a way that pays off. We also have an opportunity and an obligation to reduce the threat. If we know a large classroom puts kids under stress, makes them anxious, we have to think about how we reduce not necessarily the size of the class, but how we use the classroom space in a different way to allow kids to work in study carrels, to allow kids to put on headsets that separate them from the noise and the hubbub of the rest of the class. We know if a worksheet that's filled with 30 math problems is a stress producer for kids, we have to be able to put those slides in front of a child one by one and have the child experience the success of each slide by turning it over, turning a card over with the correct answer, so that he or she is not overwhelmed by the threat that's implied by the activity. Remember, if a child's been burned by one kind of activity early on in his or her life, every time we put an activity in front of him that looks like that, smells like that, is shaped like that, this child is going to have a trigger stored in the memory centers of the brain that says, let's get out of here. Dangers are coming. Let's be careful. John Ratey, a Boston area psychiatrist, wrote a book called Spark, in which he talks about the virtues and the benefits of exercise on brain function. If you have kids who are spending hours in front of video games, they're not out playing sports, they're not exercising, they're not on a treadmill, they're not moving around, their brains are not getting the stimulation they need to become the efficient organs and machines they need to be. And they're not getting the stress-reducing benefits that exercise can bring. So to de-stress kids, you have to build physical activity into the model. The first S in the end of the de-stress model is success. We have to replace the doubt that these kids have in their heads with the confidence that comes from repeated exposures to success. A lot of the kids that I know and care about, and you know and care about, don't have repeated exposure to success. Strategize means to use what they learn about brain function, about that child's brain function, to plan ahead. If you're taking a trip and you know that your car has bad tires, you're going to plan ahead and see how many miles you have to go and how many miles you're going to safely get out of that set of tires. You're going to stop in the town before they go bald, and you're going to get new tires. That makes sense. We have to plan education for kids like this. We have to look at the bumps ahead in the road and strategize, knowing what we now know in a scientific way about kids and their unique brains, about how to provide a successful experience. I think our task is clear. We have to understand the relationship between stress and learning, and I hope this presentation has helped us do that. We have to also understand why kids with learning disabilities and ADHD are particularly vulnerable to the effects of a special kind of stress. We have to correctly interpret stress-induced behaviors and differentiate those from the behaviors of a kid who's bored or angry or depressed. And we have to remember what I consider to be a personal mantra for kids: gaining control through competence. We have to help kids develop a sense of confidence and competence that can only come from success. We have to teach kids how to recognize and cope with it. With all due respect, Mrs. Davis, you talk faster than I listen. Here's another example of kids who know how they learn and know how they learn best. This teacher's got to be able to expect and respect that child's comments about how he learns best. And she or he has to do what's necessary to help match the way a child learns to the way he or she is teaching. We want kids who can identify those factors that lead both to failure and that lead to success. These kids can and must be actively taught how to do that. It's not difficult. It's not time-consuming. It can be built into every lesson for every child many times during the week. All kids can benefit from this strategy. Kids with learning disabilities and ADHD especially benefit from the strategy because unless you do this, they're not thinking about the process they're using, which in other kids might be a very efficient, fluid process, but in these kids it's not. This situation takes its emotional toll, and these kids need emotional support of the right kind. They don't need us to feel sorry for them. They need guidance and direction. They need support. They need help in looking at their own successes and how they got to them. They need help in looking at the difficulties or the failures they encounter. They need to experience the dignity of risk, of being exposed to failure and rising above it. Until they get to do that, they're going to be wallowing in this psychological and hormonal bath of stress that impairs brain function. They need a learning environment in which they experience success and the joy that comes from it. We need kids to understand the impact of stress on their learning. I'm sorry, Mrs. Greer, but I can't function under this kind of scrutiny. Isn't it curious that these several of these cartoons that I've showed you have the same theme? Kids speaking up to their teachers about how they learn best. I hope that someday, when more and more people understand the connection between stress and learning, that these aren't the stuff of cartoons, but they are the stuff of day-to-day reality. Yes, we want kids to be expressive.
So the first question, Dr. Schultz, is my child has ADHD and LD and a behavioral disorder. Where do I begin?
I think the first thing that a parent has to do, faced with the situation that many parents are faced with, that is a complex, multi-layered condition, you have to kind of decide which is the primary difficulty or disability. For kids who have ADHD and learning disabilities, there's an interplay between those two conditions that affect one or the other. Estimates range from 30 to 50% of the population in terms of overlap between those two conditions. And if your child, in addition, has a behavior disorder or exhibits behaviors that present a disorder to his learning or to the classroom, you have to look at that. I think the key is to figure out which one of those is the major impediment. We've got a lot of chicken and egg issues going on here because sometimes learning disabilities make it difficult to focus and attend. Sometimes attention deficit disorder makes it difficult to learn and creates a look-alike situation that appears like it's a learning disability, but in fact it's fluctuations in attention that are causing the learning problem. Both of those things in combination put kids under stress. They act up, they act in, they exhibit behaviors that are troubling and worrisome to us, and we then may think that that's a behavior disorder. I think it's incumbent upon the parents and the team of people working with the kids to kind of put those three conditions into a pie chart, if you will, and try to decide which at the moment is the target we want to go after. Clearly we're going to address all those issues, but we have to kind of unravel the chicken and the egg issue for kids so that we can set a priority in terms of learning. In most cases, when kids learn to be more successful at school, their behaviors improve and their learning improves. So in most cases where this trio of difficulties exists, I put my money on dealing with the underlying cause of it, and that's fear and shame and self-doubt. And I put this kid in a situation where we give him plenty of the opposite of those things, plenty of success and plenty of opportunities to feel competent.
Thank you very much. The next question that we have is from Kim, and she asks, are there any suggestions to help kids at school when the parent and the child have little control over the school environment, whether that's the class size, I'm assuming the class size or the attitude of the teachers or other professionals. Any recommendations for what she can do?
It's an excellent question, and the crux of it, I think, has to do with a parent feeling like she or he doesn't have control over the school environment, nor does the child. I think that there are many schools that have engaged parents in a way, not only through the IEP process, which is a kind of a legal process, but philosophically they involve parents in a way that makes them feel like they do have some control over the school. If parents are feeling alienated from the school or feel like the school doesn't know their child very well, I often encourage parents to create a profile, a folder, a file, a dossier on their child, explaining, giving examples in the past of how their child has been successful. Typically what happens is parents come to the schools laden with a wheelbarrow full of material showing what's wrong with their child because they want the schools to know, because the presumption is that once the school knows what's wrong, they'll do what's right. I'm going to encourage parents to try to turn this around a little bit by showing the school what has been right in the past, how kids have been successful either outside of school, in scouts, in summer camp, when they're with their grandparents. I'd like parents to help schools identify when kids can act in a way that's responsible, respectful, and courageous, and help the school create an environment that duplicates or replicates some of the environments that allow that to happen. In terms of a child being in charge of school, kids can take more charge of their own learning when they understand it more. So when teachers take the time to ask kids how they learn best, when a teacher gives an assignment, for example, the first thing he or she might say to the kids is, before you even begin to work on this assignment, I want you to think about a time when you've had an assignment like this that you've done really well. Just like this one. Let's talk about that a little bit. If a teacher spends a minute in class with kids, having them think about or talk about previous successful experiences, their minds are in a different place when they then put pencil to paper. So teachers can easily give kids more power over their learning by helping engage them cognitively in that way. And I've seen that happen in classes of 30 and 40 kids, depending on a teacher's understanding of the need to do this.
So Diamond asks, can you recommend any age-appropriate stress management tools or techniques that might help a child?
It's a good question, and it's important to differentiate the kind of stress that we're all under, kind of the generalized stress that gets in our way, and then the specific stress that my presentation and my book talks about more. That is the stress that's caused by being not in control of the situation. And I think it's important to differentiate those two things, because there are kids who can try to get more control over their environment, can understand their learning disability or their ADHD and how that impacts learning, but they still might be kids who are high-strung or wired for anxiety. We're seeing an increase in anxiety symptoms in kids across all the schools in which I work, and I hear this from people all over the country when I do presentations. There's a lot of worry about worry, if I can say that. I think things that help all people deal with stress can be used in a developmentally appropriate manner. That's exercise number one. That's easy to do. Getting physical exercise is important. And I would say get physical exercise unless your child is a competitive athlete or can compete with other kids. I'd stress exercise that's a solo exercise, swimming or long-distance running or boating or canoeing or bowling or things like that that don't put a child with, let's say, directionality problems or gross motor coordination problems in competition with other kids who are going to literally run circles around them. So exercise that a child can do well, and enjoy. Bike riding around the neighborhood with a parent or another kid is as good as anything else. Nutrition is really important, and that's something we do have control over. If kids don't drink enough liquids during the day, water during the day, their brain cells and their body cells are depleted. They don't have enough nutrition, the right kinds of food to give their brains the fuel they need to process well. That adds to stress. Sleep is probably one of the biggest culprits that we have to look at. If kids are going to bed late or they're staying up late, whether they're watching TV or they're filled with anxious fears or they're playing screen games, they need to go to bed at a reasonable amount of time. And kids need to get 7 or 8 hours worth of sleep a night, good sleep at night, not interrupted sleep, not sleep that's interrupted by the noise of a household or by lights coming through the windows too early in the morning. If we can do whatever we can do to get kids more rested, their stress levels will go down. So sleep, nutrition, exercise, other things that help relax the brain like yoga, deep breathing exercises, teaching a kid self-hypnosis. And that sounds a little mystical, but you can teach kids to be more reflective and more mindful and be more aware of their breathing and their heart rate and their skin temperatures at a very early age. A lot of kindergarten classes, even preschools that I know of, kids, teachers are starting the day and with yoga exercises and stretching exercises and talking to kids about the idea of what stress feels like. A lot of the kids that we're talking about, whether because they're young or they don't read their body sensations well, don't understand what it means to be under stress. So they have to be taught they have to be taught about the feelings that represent stress, and only when they're taught about those feelings, about the way they're breathing, about the way their body's feeling, can they do anything about it. So I think there's there are a lot of things that don't take a lot of time, don't take a lot of money, don't really take a lot of energy, and are good for the entire family that I'd encourage families to do. If you're not sure about which activities would be good at which developmental levels, a classroom teacher is a good source, of the guidance counselor in your child's school is a good source of information about de-stressing activities for kids.
Thank you, Dr. Schultz. The next question comes from Laura. And it's actually, I think it's a great question. She asks, when, if ever, is it appropriate to mete out consequences after an unwanted behavior, even if it's a maladaptive response to stress?
Laura, that's an excellent question, because sometimes we get, as people in special education, we get accused of being soft on kids and not giving them consequences. I think it's really important to differentiate the behavior from the cause of the behavior. If the behavior is caused by stress, that is, kids act out and act up or become aggressive because they're under stress, there always has to be some kind of consequence for that. And the consequence doesn't mean getting stuck in a corner or being yelled at or being punished. The consequence means that behavior, Johnny, is the consequence may just be saying to a child, Johnny, that behavior is unacceptable. I understand that you're upset, and I understand that this is something that you do sometimes when you're upset, but that behavior has three consequences. And I'm speaking in many more words than I typically use with a child, but that behavior gets in the way of your learning, that behavior gets in the way of other kids' learning, and that behavior gets in the way of my teaching, and that behavior gets in the way of the safety of the classroom. Therefore, Johnny, it has to stop. If you can stop it yourself and gain self-control, that'd be wonderful. If you can't, I'm going to help you do that. That means we might take a walk around the building. That might mean we might put on headphones and listen to music. That might mean you go to the self-calming box in the room if you're a preschool, kindergarten, elementary school child, and get out one of those toys or tools that helps you relax. But I think it's really important for people to be honest about this. You can't allow these behaviors to go on day after day. You can understand them, but you can't tolerate them all the time because they are disruptive to learning. So I think every behavior ought to have some kind of consequence, and the consequence ought to be matched to the let's say the size of the infraction. You know, if a child does something dangerous and hurts another child, he has to apologize for it. The other child has to be made physically safe and psychologically safe. That might require a timeout to think and calm down and make a commitment to coming back into a classroom or program might be a part of that. I think the big mistake is punishing kids in a punitive way every time a child does something like this, and it just creates a cycle that isn't getting the child where we want him to go.
How can parents, teachers, and other adults remember to consider the underlying cause of unwanted behaviors due to stress in ADHD and LD? After all, the behavior can cause stress in parents who may not remember to respond with the child's disability in mind.
It's a great question, and you know what? We're human beings. We don't always respond in the way that a textbook or a psychologist might tell us to respond. I know I don't. I've got children and grandchildren, and you know, I know all about this stuff, but sometimes in the heat of a moment or in a stressful moment in my own life or in the family life, I might not respond in a way that other people would judge to be the very best way to do it. But the point is, if you try to do it, if you're conscious of it, and you're aware that you should do it, and when you do it, it has a good payoff. That's really what I would hope that you as parents and what teachers would do as well. What happens often is parents lose their cool, lose their temper, look really mad or mean or scary to their kids at a moment when their kids can handle it not very well at all. And so here's a time when kids need to have you be a rock in the middle of a stormy place for them, and because you're a human being, it may not happen. I would just say try to minimize those times. If you find you're responding to kids by yelling and screaming and you're always at your wit's end, get some professional help to deal with this. Get somebody to talk to you about how to break that cycle. Clearly it's stressful, it's frustrating. You've got a kid with mild to moderate special needs having difficulty all the time. There are a lot of things that are going on in your family, everybody's family. It's hard to keep all these balls in the air at one time. The point is always think about what you've done, and then don't try to excuse it. I mean, you can say, Johnny, I'm sorry that I blew up, and I know that's not helpful, and I'll try next time to do a better job. But you can't say that every time you blow up unless there are interludes between those blow-ups that are calm and peaceful. So I would say to parents who are under stress, do some of those stress-busting things that I talked about earlier about kids for yourself, even for moments of time, so you can pull yourself together. Kids need that from us.
How does one find a team of professionals who gets it? I found that many psychologists, pediatricians, teachers, and so forth do not understand ADHD adequately. Those who may have the knowledge and experience to help a child cope with chronic stress are usually unaffordable for many families. Affordability and accessibility are obstacles that need to be addressed. Do you have any recommendations for dealing with these issues?
It's a very good question. First thing I want to say is that if you're a parent seeking out professional help, it is typically an expensive proposition. I'll talk about ways to get help without having it be so expensive in just a minute, but remember that you have the right and the responsibility to talk to a clinician, either by a telephone appointment or an initial visit, even if you have to pay for it with that person, to ask him or her what his experience has been with kids with learning disabilities or ADHD, what their approach is, what strategies they use, and most importantly, how effective their interventions are. This is a consumer-oriented age that we're living in, and doctors, psychologists, social workers, mental health workers really expect to be asked that question. And it's important to ask it and expect an answer. You may be working with a younger clinician who hasn't had as much experience as someone who's been in the field for a long time, but that person might have just the right kind of energy and attitude and spirit to work with your child and you as a family. There's also an issue of whether or not the therapist or counselor or helping person is going to be working with a child or the family. It's hard for me to imagine these problems being isolated at the level of a child. I think the most effective treatments that I know I've provided over the years are treatments that provide service to a child but also include the family, because this child is not the cause of the problem. The child has a problem that affects a lot of people around him or her. So again, just to recap, ask for other people if they've had experience with these clinicians. Ask the clinician themselves what their experience has been. Present to them a hypothetical or a real situation that you've been dealing with, and see how they'd respond to it, and push for details. That's okay to do. It's an expensive proposition. You wouldn't buy a new car without taking it out for a test drive, and you want to do the same thing with the therapist. And if it doesn't work, feel okay saying to that person, I'm sorry, you seem like a nice enough person, but I don't think your approach matches our needs. Thanks for your time, and we're gonna think about this and look around a little bit, and do just that. Don't walk away from therapy because you had one experience that didn't feel right with one person. There are lots of wonderful people out there who provide a lot of help to children and families. The other thing I would do is ask school guidance staff about people they've worked with who have been really helpful and who communicate well with the school, because it's important, if your child is in outside therapy, outside of school, that there's a bridge that's built between the home, the therapist, and the school. When those three parts don't happen in a collaborative fashion, kids get less well served. So I want to encourage you to do that. In terms of the expensive services, some therapists may say, well, it's my traditional approach to see kids every week. Some parents say twice a week. Well, some kids need therapy with that level of intensity. Other kids, because of your financial situation, might be able to be supported by therapy or counseling every other week or less frequently. I would give the therapist the time in the beginning to work weekly with your child if that's their mode, because it helps build up some momentum and helps relationships develop. And once that happens, you can taper off a little bit. Your kids have busy lives, you have busy lives. Sometimes weekly therapy is a big intrusion on the normal life cycle that you live. Using school guidance staff, social workers, guidance counselors, school adjustment counselors to their fullest extent of their availability and their skill is really important too. These people are well-trained, well-meaning, and usually nice people go into mental health. So if you let them help you and you're able to let them know what your worries are and give them a chance to respond to those, you can develop a relationship that can last over several years for a child in school and will really cost you nothing except the time it takes to relate to those professionals. There are also self-help groups. CHAD has parent-to-parent training sessions. The Learning Disabilities of America site has resources for parents and that can be very helpful in terms of management. There are a lot of things. There are a lot of resources online, and some parents may feel like they're overwhelmed by the amount of information. But if you stick to reputable sources and don't be tempted to stray into the kind of the never land of the non-recognized agencies that have been around for a long time serving kids like we were talking about, you should be okay.
The next question, Dr. Schultz, is a good general question. I think it's, what role does medication have in addressing ADHD? And maybe, I don't know your thoughts on learning disabilities as well as it relates to chronic stress and managing the impact of those disorders.
I have to answer this question in the context of the reality that I'm not a physician. I don't prescribe medications. As a clinical neuropsychologist, I need to know something about medications. But it's my experience over the past 35 or 37 years of my clinical practice that medication has been a very helpful tool in the management of ADD or ADHD when it exhibits a significant impediment in the lives of kids. I am not an advocate for using medication as a solo means of trying to fix a problem, and I think the audience understands that quite well. But when and I am also an advocate of doing everything you can first that's reasonable before attempting medication to help a child gain a greater sense of self-control. The stress management, self-control strategies that I talked about earlier can be helpful. Making sure that the situation at school is the most conducive it can be to learning for most kids, that there are clear rules, clear expectations. If a classroom or a school is chaotic, it's kind of hard to imagine a child who's all over the place functioning well in that environment. So medication is not a solution to a chaotic classroom or a disorganized teacher. That may require a talk with a building principal to talk about switching teachers the next year, so your child, or switching teachers in the middle of the year, so that your child has what he or she needs in terms of an environment that's predictable and calm and controlled. Because otherwise you see some of the symptoms you see in some kids, some of the behaviors you see in some kids are consequences of being in an environment that's unpredictable. So I'm straying from the medication issue a little bit, but unless everything else that can be done that doesn't involve medication is done and done fairly quickly and is evaluated for its effectiveness, then I don't think you should move to medication too quickly. I know a lot of parents have concerns and questions about the safety of medications. Those are questions that have to be asked of your pediatrician. You have to do some reading about those. I have never in all my years seen a negative reaction to medication that wasn't fixed by stopping the medication under the good guidance of a good qualified psychiatrist or pediatrician. I've never seen a situation where medication, when it's been appropriately diagnosed and dosed, and that's an important piece, has been harmful to a child. And I've seen lots and lots of kids. I'm in lots and lots of schools. That said, I absolutely respect a parent's desire to stay away from medications if that's if they have concerns about the safety factors. But I think that to not consider medication in a child when you've manipulated or managed all those things I talked about before, the home environment, the school environment, the regularity of a child's schedule, if you've done all those things and you've done them fairly well, and the child is still having difficulty navigating or living in that world that you've created and made better for him, then I would certainly consider medication as a possibility. A short-term dose of the appropriate medication administered by a physician who has experience doing this, and in a situation where the school is giving feedback to the pediatrician or the psychiatrist about the effects of the medication, something that does not happen often enough, then I think you're missing an opportunity to help a child. When you can meet all those conditions, then you're taking advantage of an opportunity to help a child in a really significant way. And it doesn't have to be forever. You want kids to be accessible to learning. You want kids to feel like they're in charge of their bodies and their minds, and sometimes a little bit of medication for a short amount of time can help that happen, so the child can finally get to the point where he or she has the peace of mind, if you will, to learn the self-control strategies that he's not able to learn while he's in that state of mental chaos. If a child has learning disabilities and ADHD and the medication can help quell the ADHD, then the learning disabilities may not be as severe because the child can now focus attention in those areas in which he or she has difficulty. If the child has either ADHD or learning disabilities and also has anxiety, again, you have to decide if anxiety is the primary disability or difficulty, and in some cases treating the anxiety may help a child become more relaxed, so he or she learns more efficiently, the learning disability doesn't look as severe, and the ADHD quiets down and doesn't look quite as severe because the anxiety that's there has been softened a bit by the use of medication and or therapy.
Can continued production of cortisol be a health risk for my child? And the second question, what are some good age-appropriate models for teaching kids about stress, the brain, and their disabilities?
Clearly, it can be harmful to a child, both in terms of the neurobiology and the physical reactions to stress that a child is having. If the cortisol production cycle, the stress cycle gets disrupted in a way in which the feedback between the organisms in the brain and the body that are responsible for regulating stress, if those get out of whack and cortisol production is too high, the body and the brain have a wonderful, miraculous capacity to adjust itself to respond to that. But what happens is when they do that by turning down the worry quotient. They say, well, you know, that's not really a big a deal. The brain is saying to the body, that's not really as big a stressor as you think it is, so we're going to shut ourselves down a little bit. That's not a good reaction. There needs to be a healthy, content balance between stress and cortisol, and if the system gets out of whack because the stress is unabated, that's unhealthy physiologically for kids. You can, as I said in the presentation, you can turn that around once you recognize the fact that stress is too high in kids, and you understand that in some kids teaching them to have a sense of competence over their environment can reduce stress. You can turn this cycle around. I think you can start talking to kids about differences in learning style very early in life. Preschoolers can be taught about the way they think, and a parent can say to a preschooler, you know, you're really solving that problem really quickly. You might just want to slow it down a little bit, and if you can, you might be surprised what happens. And so a parent can use language and modeling of a very young child to reflect the learning approach a child is using and modify it or suggest a modification that might have a bigger payoff. But that's not like saying to a preschool child, oh my goodness, you have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and you need to get a grip. It's really an opportunity to observe behaviors that are in fact getting in the way of normal development and normal learning, and being able to comment on those to a child and model a different approach. As kids get older, you can have units in school about learning differences and learning disabilities and even attention deficit hyperactivity disorder as part of science lessons. So kids then can be encouraged to think about whether or not they have impediments to their own learning that are caused by difficulties in perception that might be a part of a learning disability, or that might have difficulties in learning that are related to difficulties in attention and focusing. But I think that you don't necessarily have to use the labels, and I know there are a lot of people who are concerned about the use of the label, the disability label inherent in the learning disability terminology, and people choose to talk about learning differences, and I think that's fine for a child who might be upset by it. But then there comes a time when you may want to send a child to, let's say, the children's part of the LDA site, Learning Disabilities of America, and those clubs have names for a reason. The condition is called learning disability or learning disorder. So I think it's important to be honest about that. All of us have learning differences. Some of those learning differences are so severe and so and create so much of an impediment that they may be considered a disability at that time. But that's a semantic issue that you have to deal with. But at any rate, I think the more kids understand how they learn, when they do things well, why they did them well, when they do things that they didn't think were as good as they could have done, what to help kids understand what they could have done a little bit differently to make the outcome happen in a better way. Having those discussions about the process that kids use so that they can be encouraged to try another process that might be more effective, I think is the pathway to a greater sense of self-understanding in kids. On the other end of the developmental continuum, it's wonderful when you see a kid who's heading off to college who has a history of a learning disability writing about his or her learning disability in a college application essay and talking about how through self-understanding he began to conquer his stress and subdue his stress and then learn strategies that allowed him or her to be as successful as they are at that moment in time. That's a letter that a college likes to hear from a kid. I mean, there are a lot of kids in the world with ADHD and learning disabilities, and some of those kids, many of those kids, effectively manage those conditions so they can be very, very successful in a highly competitive environment.
I'm going to ask two questions again. The first has to do with rewards as an incentive for helping students or children with learning disabilities or ADHD do their homework or what have you, or their other assignments. And the second has to do with technology, assistive technology. And the questioner would like to get your thoughts on how it can help a child with learning disabilities or ADHD.
Okay, I think the first question was about rewards or reinforcements. I mean, most of us don't work for nothing. Some of us have the luxury of doing that. The payoff for a lot of kids in school for working hard is the feeling of success that they have from doing that work well and getting the praise of their parents, the praise of their teachers, the admiration and the respect of their classmates. If you think about a child with learning disabilities or significant ADHD who doesn't have those successful experiences all the time, you might need to do something to sweeten the pot. Usually when kids with a long history of LD and ADHD do things in school and they do things well, they know that the next thing that will happen to them is they're going to get more work to do. So there's almost sometimes a disincentive to do well because it's safe just to stay in academic neutral some of the time, although you don't move very far in terms of your academic progress. I think the judicious use of reinforcements for kids to help them take that next difficult step is not a bad idea. I think what happens that's unfortunate is that some kids learn very quickly not to do any kind of work without any kind of payoff. And in some families, in some situations, that payoff is enormous. It totally lacks any kind of relationship between the intensity of the task. So if a child says, well, yes, I'll read that chapter in my book tonight, but I get another Lego set or I get another video game for my Xbox, that situation gets out of whack very quickly. What I would say to parents who are thinking about using reward or reinforcement systems is to say to a child, how much more work do you think you could do tomorrow if you got one of the things on your reward list? And the reward list implies that you sit down with the child saying, well, what are some incentives? If you're down and you need a little more reinforcement to get yourself going, what are some things you'd put on that list that might get you going a little bit more? It might get you over a hurdle. So you give a child a chance to put down a whole list of things. It might range from a new computer to I don't want to say something simple, a new coloring book or something like that. Then a parent has the opportunity to say, well, let's draw a line here. These things below the line are quite possible that we could provide as incentives if you need them. But the ones above the list, like an Xbox 360 or something, they're not going to happen. You may want to put those on your Christmas or your Hanukkah list, but they're not going to happen because you do your homework, because that's abnormal. You don't need to say that, but that's my feeling about it. And then you can say to a child, look, you've got a homework challenge. How big is that challenge on a scale of 1 to 5? Now, that assumes you've practiced this 1 to 5 scale. If the child says to you, that's a 5, no way, Mom and Dad, can I do that? And you say, well, if you pick one of the things from your incentive list, do you think you could get it down to a 3 level of difficulty? And the child says, yeah, maybe I could. In that situation, maybe you want to use a reinforcer. You don't want to get into a habit of doing it. You want to get the kid to be successful and competent so he or she can have that sense of reward that other kids have. That's the goal, not paying him off with prizes and trinkets for doing what's expected in a normal day. The question about assistive technology, another excellent question. Every opportunity has to be used to give kids the assistive technology they need so that their brains, their smart little brains, can access the materials and the tasks that we put before them. If assistive technology, whether that means a math reinforcement activity or a learning software that helps them read better or hear books read to them, whatever it takes. If kids can get access to curriculum and feel successful doing it through assistive technology, it must be provided. In this day and age, there's very little excuse. Certainly these things cost money, but most schools have an abundance of technological resource. Most schools in America have materials available. Or if they're not available, they can be borrowed from another school system. An appeal can be made to the material producers for an individual child. There are a lot of things you can do, but assistive technology should be used whenever it can help a child have access to a curriculum which he or she would otherwise find very challenging using traditional media like print or like writing.
Sure. Thank you very much. We do have time for one last question, and this question comes from Mary. In the de-stress model, can you give an example of teaching strategies that maximize success? And I believe Mary is referring to the T in your de-stress model.
Okay. So the teach part of the model means that once you understand a child's learning disability or difficulty, and once the child understands the difficulty or disability, you have to teach the child ways to move through the difficulty or around it. In terms of assistive technology, the teaching may be, well, if you can't read that material yourself at grade level and you need to read it for a homework assignment, I'm going to teach you how to use this computer software that will read that text to you so you can listen with your very effective ears and very effective listening brain to get that information that you might not get through your eyes. So the teaching part of the teaching model may also be for a child who's under stress, for example. You might say, look, whenever I give you a worksheet that's filled with more than 10 math problems, I get a reaction from you that says, I'm not going to do this. This is stupid. This is dumb. And we've talked about this, Sally. This is you under stress. And Sally smiles, and because you've had this discussion before, and she said, you're right. I'm going to teach you a strategy, 2 strategies that you're going to use when you're under stress. We're going to take this worksheet and you're going to look at it. And if your brain is saying to you, oh, teacher, this is way too difficult for me, even though you know and I know that the problems that are contained on this worksheet are not too difficult, the strategy is just simply to fold your paper in half or fold it in quarters, or to have your teacher present these math problems to you on 3x5 cards one at a time, or on a computer screen one at a time, so that you look at them and you say, well, I know how to do that. So you reduce the threat of the activity by presenting it simply in a different way. Same material, same level of difficulty, but a different mode of presentation. I think the teach model really, for me, in terms of stress and dealing with stress, has to do with teaching kids ways to listen to what their brain is saying to them when they encounter an activity that in reality or in their perception is too hard for them. And once you get them to be able to tell you and then ultimately tell themselves what their brain is saying, they can create an alternative message to tell their brain to do something else. I just read an article that said if people are trying to go on a diet, to say, I can't eat chocolate is less effective than saying, I won't eat chocolate. Just the way that you use words to tell your brains what it's going to do can be helpful. So the teach part of the model means finding out where the impediment is, finding out what the child is saying to herself about that impediment, teaching the child a different way to approach the task, or teaching the child something else to say to herself that guides the brain in a more positive, success-oriented fashion. I hope that answer was helpful. I realize it was a bit generalized, and it's hard to respond without a specific problem that I'm dealing with, but I hope that answer was helpful to people listening.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Schultz. Sadly, we have come to our last question. I would like to thank you on behalf of the National Resource Center, CHAD, and the Learning Disability Association of America, and all of our audience participants for sharing your insight and experience with us. This concludes our webinar, and we wish everyone to have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Adisa. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Take care.